first. All right, recording's working. Today's topic is volunteers. And I want to start off with a poll. Pardon just one second. Let's go ahead and open this poll and ask some questions. All right, are you able to see the poll? Yep, we're started. People are diving in. I can't read the whole poll question, so if I mess up, help me out, guys. I'll give you just a few minutes to read through these poll questions. First of which is how many, oh, there we go, make it so I can see it. How many volunteers does your organization utilize? We've got a good chunk of you in progress. Some of you are fast, you've already finished. How many volunteers does your organization utilize? Which tasks are volunteers most used for most? Do you maintain a roster of approved volunteers? Are all of your volunteers on that list? All right. So we got about 63% finished. There's a few hardcore folks out there that are like, not participating. Let's start to go through those as everybody's finishing. How many volunteers does your organization use? And it looks like it's kind of spread out. Let me close the poll. We're close. Close the poll. It's not allowing me to close it. Well, we'll just go with it how it is. How many, oh, you know what? It's got a bubble that's popping up. There we go. Hopefully we can finish that up. All right, I closed the polls. And let's take a look at this. How many volunteers does your organization use? Fewer than full-time employees, about 35%. That's the biggest number that we have fewer than the full-time employees that work there. Okay, that's actually a little surprising to me. About the same number, 13%, and more than full-time employees, 21%. That was actually the category that I figured that we would see for many of our smaller entities, where you have, you're a small town and you have a half a dozen full-time employees and maybe 20 or 30 volunteer firefighters. Anyway, so kind of spread out. Which tasks are volunteers used for most? And it looks like other fills that role. 54% said events, library, parks administration. About 12% said public safety. Okay. Next question, do you maintain a roster of approved volunteers? 42% said yes. 29% said no. And then we had about 29% that just didn't answer. So are all of your volunteers on that list? 17% said yes, 23% said no, 19% said not sure, and then we had about 40% did not participate. Wow. Okay, Doug and Brent, what do you think about that?
Interesting. I wonder how many don't use volunteers because the only option was fewer.
All right. I should have had that on there. That's a good point. Any thoughts, Doug? I don't think we can hear Doug.
Yeah, I was having trouble turning my mute off. So, I think there are, members out there not using employees or volunteers, especially the special service districts. So when you kind of look at the membership base, we think of cities and counties, and I'm sure all of those probably have some volunteers, but then, probably half the membership are special service districts that probably don't use volunteers at all.
Yeah, kind of interesting results and a pretty good sampling of our members as we look at the signups. So, all right, that gives us a little bit to go on as we dive in. So, what about volunteers? Some of you may not even be utilizing volunteers. Some of you couldn't pull off your operations without volunteers. They are such an integral part of what you do that if somebody said, sorry, no more volunteers, you'd be done and couldn't do your operations. So what's so great about volunteers? Number one, they work for free. We don't have to pay these guys, and that's great. Many times we can get skills from volunteers that we couldn't afford to pay for. Sometimes you'll have an attorney volunteer times or his or her time. Maybe you'll have a doctor, or maybe you'll have somebody with some excellent skills, mechanical skills, contractors and people like that we would have a hard time paying for, but because they're volunteering, we get great skills and great talent to help us out. Many times it's just we need a lot of help. We're pulling off of an event, town days, something like that. We need a lot of hands to be able to pull this off. Here in the state of Utah, we pulled off the Olympics. It took over 30,000 volunteers for us to be able to pull off the Olympics. If we had to pay all those people, it wouldn't have happened, and I'm here to tell you, we wouldn't have had as good of results, even if people were paid to do those jobs. Volunteers generally have good attitudes. They're there for the right reason. They're volunteering in their community, and they want to help their communities be a better place. And so they come into that with a good attitude, maybe better than the average full-time employee, just because of the circumstances in which they come to work. So volunteers are good. Can they get us into trouble? And the answer is maybe. Here's a couple of things to think about when we talk about volunteers. They represent our organization. They represent us. So if they're out there working along and we give them a T-shirt or a hat or an apron or something that says our organization's name on it, that's just as much they're representing us as our employees or our your mayor or county council or other elected official or board member. They're standing up in front of the public and they represent us. Does that put us at some risk? Yeah. They're more difficult to control. We don't have the paycheck hanging over their head to control what they do. And occasionally we see some kind of odd things happen with volunteers where they kind of go off the tracks. That's not the regular thing, but occasionally it does happen. They do expose us to risk. What type of risks? Well, really the same or sometimes greater than an employee. They expose us to liability, workers' compensation exposure, and at the end of the day, we're on the hook. How do we protect our organizations from this type of risk? And really the answer that I have is we need to own it. We need to make a decision that if we're going to have volunteers, we've got to own it. We've got to work to minimize the risk that we have. It doesn't take anything away from the value that these volunteers have to us. We've just got to manage them well. Here's a question that came in: do unpaid interns count as volunteers? And the answer is yes. But let's talk about that in just a second when we define who is a volunteer. So liability risks. If a volunteer commits a criminal act, steals from our organization, maybe they do something to a member of the community. Maybe they're a coach and they do something to hurt a child under their care. Does that expose us to potential liability? Potentially, yeah. It could be a big deal to us. Harassment, discrimination. We spend a lot of time training our employees on how to appropriately interact with people to avoid harassment and discrimination. How much time do we spend with our volunteers? Are we more exposed to that type of liability with a volunteer? I'd venture a guess to say yes. Auto liability. Do we allow our volunteers to drive our vehicles? Are they out operating their vehicles under the guise of being part of our organization? How does that affect us? And probably overall, like we mentioned, is what about our reputation? if that volunteer does something that goes over a line, how does that reflect on our organization's reputation? All right. From a workers' compensation standpoint, volunteers get hurt sometimes, and many people have a question: Are they covered? Before I dive into the workers' compensation side of things, we ask, well, what about that general liability thing? Our employee is out driving, or our volunteers out driving one of our vehicles, and they get in a crash, and it's their fault. Are they covered? Well, the insurance follows the vehicle. So if it's your vehicle, the coverage is there for your liability. They are out doing a job, and they do something negligent and hurt somebody from the community. That coverage is there. Well, let's switch gears over to workers' compensation. Volunteers have a tendency to get hurt at times, depending on the type of tasks that they have and how well they're trained and how well they're prepared. They might get hurt. Are they covered? Here's the answer to that. It's a yes and a no. All approved volunteers have workers' compensation medical coverage. What does it mean to be an approved volunteer? That means you need to know that they're a volunteer, and you need to have them on a roster that your chief executive approves. So if you're in a city, the mayor or the city manager will be signing that off. Now, the chief executive doesn't have to sign. He or she can designate a person to sign off on that list, but it needs to be maintained so we know who those volunteers are. So with that, they have workers' compensation coverage. Then we ask a question, what about indemnity coverage? And that's where we get into the yes and no side of things. If they work in public safety, say they're fire, EMS, search and rescue, law enforcement volunteers, they have that indemnity coverage. Now, this is not just something that the trust does. This is a statutory requirement in the state. And so some of these groups were not covered on this just as soon as just a few years ago. They did not have coverage, but the statutes have changed, and so public safety has indemnity coverage. What's indemnity? That's if they lose time from their work, they can recover that. They can be made whole through the workers' compensation coverage. Other volunteers, those people who are non-public safety. So you're volunteering at the library, with the maybe parks department or an event. I'm a volunteer there, an approved volunteer. I have workers' compensation coverage for my medical. So I slice my finger, and I go in to get medical coverage. That's something that's covered as long as it's compensable loss. It's covered under workers' comp. However, if I'm injured to the point where I lose time off of work, I can't receive wages to compensate me for that loss. So that's kind of a difference between those two groups of volunteers. If you've got questions, please go ahead and type those into the chat box or the Q&A box. So just at a basic level, all of our volunteers need to be approved. We need to maintain a roster of who those volunteers are. We realize there are times when you have a community cleanup, and everybody in the community comes out and they're sweeping up or picking up garbage around the streets in the community. I wouldn't list those on your list of approved volunteers. That's more of a community event. These would be people who are regularly working as a volunteer. It may be only one specific event that they're working on, but they volunteer in planning and preparing for that. Make sure that list is signed off by the chief executive or designate. Also be aware of any loose associations that we may have out there. Is there a community organization that is separate from our organization that has kind of snuggled up to us, that maybe they help us out we need to look at those agreements that we have and be careful that we're not taking on risk that we don't intend to take on. There can be situations where a group doesn't have a lot of formal organization, or even if it does, they don't have workers' compensation coverage or liability coverage, and that could end up potentially coming back on us if we don't have specific agreements in place and indemnification. So if we've got that type of a group, ensure that we have an indemnification agreement and a certificate of insurance from that organization naming us as additional insured. So where does this come into play? It could be things like sports, where we have a little league or similar organization that comes into our cities, counties, and they use our facilities, and it may appear that they are a part of our organization. If we have a group like that, if we're not controlling their operations, controlling what they do, we should put some distance between us and them. If they are part of our organization, we should be aware of what they're doing, and we should be able to exercise some level of control over that organization to ensure that they do things safely, that they're trained, that they're equipped with the things that they need to do. All right.
We've got a couple questions there, Jason.
All right.
In the Q&A.
We are a private nonprofit. Do we also cover volunteers for work comp medical? Volunteers, that's a state definition, and I'm not going to say 100%, but 99% yes. The law was changed back prior to the Olympics in the state to allow workers' compensation coverage for SLOC, for the Salt Lake Organizing Committee for the Olympics. Because we had 35,000 volunteers, workers' compensation is a preferable way to go. Is a preferable way to manage a workplace injury than a general liability claim. It's a statutory system. It's defined how that all works, and so that's the preferable route to go about it than a general liability claim. And so I will verify that with legal counsel as far as private nonprofits, but 99% sure on that because of the change in that law. It's just I haven't looked at that recently. Let's see. Question similar to that is on church groups, and I'm assuming that means I'll partway answer this one. If a church group comes in to our organization to do service, do we ask them to produce a certificate of insurance? And my answer is yes. I would prefer to do that, just because of the protection. We want to be protected from those things. If the Boy Scouts, I have a slide on this, but if the Boy Scouts want to come in and do some work, do we ask them for a certificate of insurance? And my answer is yes. And they're good to provide those things, but that gives us a level of protection since we don't control that, but maybe they're doing some work for us. All right. It looks like we got a lot of questions here. Are health department volunteers considered public safety? Does it depend on their job description? And yeah, it absolutely depends on the job description. I do not believe health department falls into the categories that are defined in the state code, but that is something that we will follow up on. But I hadn't had that specific question come up. It's pretty specific. That is, it's law enforcement, fire, EMS, and search and rescue. Those areas are ones that have been specifically defined, but we'll check on health department people as well. How often should the volunteer roster be updated and signed by the chief executive? You know, I would look at really your turnover. At least once a year you need to do that, but I would be doing probably at least twice per year. to update those, because we kind of have, in many of our organizations, we'll have a couple of seasons. You'll have the big ramp up to the summer event season, and I would have that your main time to sign that roster and update that as we bring on those summer volunteers that are helping out. But maybe do it a couple of times during the year and capture the names that have just showed up. Okay. What is a COI? That's a certificate of insurance. That's a certificate that shows that this other organization has coverage, and they're naming your organization as an additional insured in there. So it gives you protection under their policy, also indemnifies us for things that they do. Let's see. For our once per year event, we have volunteers conduct a tennis tournament. Are they and the participants covered under our regular play on the tennis court? The Lions Club also provides dinner. Okay, a few questions here. So your volunteers, if they're approved, yes, they have workers' compensation coverage. The participants would not be. They're on their own when it comes to participating in these events, and that's why, you know, as we have them sign up, there should be some sort of indemnification on that, where we're letting them know that this is on them if they get injured. Realizing that tennis may be a hazardous sport for them to play. So something is part of their event. They twist their knee while they're playing tennis. That's really would be covered under their own personal medical insurance. If we had something that was negligent on our part, where we had a nail sticking out on the tennis court, or a big crack. Let's say we got a big crack in the surface of the tennis court, and the person trips. So we've been negligent in maintaining our facilities. It could be a general liability claim, but wouldn't be a workers' compensation claim. All right, I think I'm going to go back to questions a little bit later, because I got to get through all this stuff. And I think maybe we can answer a lot of these as we move along. All right, but I will get back to those questions. So how do we select volunteers? You say select. We're just trying to get people to take these jobs. We just got to get people to help out. Well, that's where we run into a lot of problems with volunteers, is if we don't do a good job selecting them. We put them in a position that they're not capable of doing, or that they're not a good fit. Maybe they get injured because they're not physically capable to do the task that we ask them to do. So my recommendation is to treat bringing a volunteer on similar to hiring an employee. What do you do when you hire somebody? Well, we want to verify that they're capable of doing the tasks that we ask them, that they have the skills, the knowledge. Not that we can't train, but we want to get people who are capable to do the tasks. Are they available? Can they meet the schedule that we want to require of them? Do they have the ability to do the job? What about their background? If they're working with certain sensitive groups like children or maybe seniors that don't have a mental capacity, that could be vulnerable to somebody that would take advantage of them, do we do a background check on them? Anybody that's going to be driving a vehicle for your organization should be in the motor vehicle record check program. So once a month we send out that report so you can see that they have a good driving record. Okay? If they don't have a valid driver's license, we don't want them driving for us, and so that's an important check that we do ahead of hiring them. I would recommend that you have some sort of an offer or a letter to this volunteer that says, "Thank you very much for volunteering here. Here's what we expect you to do. Here are the things that the physical requirements of doing this volunteer task. Here are the sorry, I lost my mind there for a second. Here are Here's the schedule that we expect you to meet. So going into this, we don't have any misunderstandings of what the volunteer will be required to do. So a job description. Here are the duties and expectations. We also want to look at training. How do we prepare this volunteer so we're successful? And part of that is getting them trained on the job and not just throwing them to the wolves and say, thanks for volunteering, go do your job. All right. So we also want to gather some information from this volunteer. It's important to be able to contact them. It's important to have emergency numbers for the volunteers in the event that they get injured or have a medical problem or we can't find them. How do we go about contacting next of kin? So gathering some information like we would on an employee would be an important thing. If they're taking a job similar to a coach or somebody working with the senior center, let's look at an interview or look at references for this person. What about background checks? Where do we use those? Some people say, yep, we background check everybody. Some people say we don't background check anybody. I think both of those scenarios are probably problematic. So why do we do background checks? Really, it's if we have people working with populations that are at risk, children, vulnerable adults, somebody who's working with money. They have a fiduciary responsibility. Maybe they're taking money. They're dealing with a treasurer of an organization that we sponsor. Those types of positions we would probably put into a background check. Okay. This issue is a little more complicated than it may seem, though, when we're doing background checks. The EEOC has made a statement recently on this, as well as the Fair Credit Reporting Act gets into background checks, and so we have to be careful what we do with the information and how we use it, because this subject is not, we don't have time to go deep into detail on background checks. I'll refer you to a webinar that we did earlier. I believe earlier in the year. It's on our website in the loss prevention category, utahtrust.gov/webinars, and then click on loss prevention. It's called background checks, and it goes into great detail as far as how do we manage those. Just a couple of things to be aware of is who do we background check? One, if they're required by law. Certain positions require that we do a background check. If they have access to vulnerable groups or fiduciary responsibilities, those would be the areas, or people that have secret or confidential information access. Those would be other areas. There are laws surrounding this. I'm not going to take time to go into that, but just be aware that regulatory agencies are watching how we utilize background check information. So the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and the FTC, or Federal Trade Commission, are also looking at how we use this data. So if you have questions, please go and refer to that webinar. When we do background checks, really from an employment standpoint, it's when it's contingent, or we have an offer for a job contingent on passing a drug screen, passing an MVR check, passing a background check. And so with a volunteer, it would be when we get to that point where we're going to take them on as a coach, or take them on as whatever position puts them more at risk and where they need a background check. Okay, so what do we check? MVRs, criminal records. There's all kinds of things that we can check. You can do this through a private company, through the Bureau of Criminal Investigation. Some people say, well, we just have our PD run a check on their criminal record. I would really caution that direction. I would stay away from that, and really I would probably focus more on using the Bureau of Criminal Investigation. This is something you do through the state. The state or the legally required ones will go through the Bureau of Criminal Investigation. To do these checks, you need to apply to be a qualified entity and have a point of contact. And that person, of course, will be background checked, so we know that they're okay and not going to misuse the information that they get. There are various different kinds: name searches, fingerprint searches, and various different checks. But they're not perfect. They don't catch everything. Basically, we look at 8 Western states, not including California. Other FBI databases may be a little broader, but they're not going to catch everything, and they take time. So be aware of that. And this is just the public safety page. Here's some issues with the database. Be careful taking action on background checked information, because the data is not always complete. Somebody may have an arrest, but it may not result in a conviction. If we take action on somebody that's been arrested for something and they're later acquitted of that, that can put us in a bad position. So be very careful of that. Sometimes accuracy is a problem, and sometimes they're not up to date. So background checks are good things, but go into it knowing that they do have their limitations. There is no one comprehensive database that has all the information about everybody. So be aware of that. Watch out making decisions on sketchy data without follow-up. So that follow-up is an important step, to ask questions about those things. Have a policy that states how we go about doing our investigations. Get your attorney to review that regularly. Have a good job description that says this is what we're expecting you to do. Okay. Oh boy, there's going to be a lot of questions, huh? When we talk about volunteers, what is an appropriate age for volunteers? And people say, well, anybody, right? We're not paying them. Our guidance on that is to follow child labor laws. That's really the best guideline that we have, and it basically says that if they're under 14, we don't want them working for us as an employee, and I would say as a volunteer either. Does that mean that the scouts, the 12-year-old scouts or Girl Scouts coming onto our property can't volunteer? And that's not what I'm saying. They can do it under their organization name, but we don't want to take them on as a volunteer at these younger ages. Doug did a great presentation on child labor and seasonal employees earlier in the year, and that webinar is also recorded on our website, and he goes into a lot of detail on that. But 14 and 15-year-olds can do certain tasks, but we should not be asking them to do hazardous or dangerous work. 16 and 17-year-olds can do more, but there are still requirements, still restrictions for what they can do. I would not have, if we can avoid it, I would not have youth volunteers driving or using any kind of mechanized equipment, heavy equipment, tractors, driving vehicles, just because of the risk it places us under. Okay. And I'm sure there are a lot of questions on that, but I will refer you back to Doug's presentation from earlier in the year. One of the important things that we have to look at is what are the hazards that our volunteers are going to be exposed to. We need to identify those things. Many times they're the same as what our employees are exposed to. And if that's the case, we should train and equip the volunteers the same as we do our employees. Okay. So in providing, does that mean we have to provide personal protective equipment to our volunteers? The answer is, if they're exposed to a hazard, yeah, you need to provide the personal protective equipment that matches the hazards that we're dealing with. Training is the same way. All right. So ask yourself, what will they perform? What hazardous tasks? Heavy equipment, fire apparatus, all of these things are really hazardous tasks. Confined space, trenches. But what about those events that we have? Demolition derbies. 2 volunteers in the state of Utah have died in just the last few years volunteering at events, at demolition derbies. And so we need to look at that. And how are we organizing these events? Are these our volunteers? We need to take the responsibility to ensure their safety. So put procedures, put equipment, whatever it is in place to protect them. You say, what training? Train these people like their employees. Have a list of the required courses. If you do this task, if you're a firefighter, and with firefighters, it's pretty regimented what they have to do. But are we asking questions of the chief? Have all of your firefighters completed the tasks that they're responsible to have? Are they certified firefighter 1? Do they have their hazmat if they're doing that? Are they, on and on with the various certifications? Ask the chief those questions. Is everybody meeting those requirements? And use resources. I know it's a challenge with volunteers to get them to training because they have day jobs. They have other responsibilities outside of that. And so I'll refer you back to some of the resources that the Trust provides. These webinars are recorded, and we place those recordings up on our website. Anybody can go in and watch those at their convenience. Middle of the night, go ahead and stream that video and of the webinar, and they can get the information they need. And then with some follow-up from you to ask them questions, if they understand, then we can get them out on the job a lot quicker and a lot easier. We also have DVDs in our library that can help facilitate training as well. We need to supervise volunteers. This is kind of a challenge. Because, well, they're volunteers. They might just leave. Well, they might. But most volunteers are going to be happy that you're there supervising them and helping them be successful in their jobs. And so that's really, we should go into that with our goal. Do we discipline volunteers? Well, there may be times when we have to let a volunteer go because they've stepped across the line that we can't really allow. But in most cases, it's coaching. It's helping somebody understand what their responsibilities are. If we see something that's amiss, take action. Don't allow that to go forward. We of course want to do it in a way that doesn't alienate our volunteers. But if somebody goes over a line, we need to take quick action there. We also need to appreciate volunteers and reward them for what they're doing for us. We're getting a ton of benefit from these volunteers. Let's appreciate them and reward them. And many times, just a thank you is reward enough for these volunteers. They don't, they're out taking time out of their schedule. Let's say thank you. Let's give them some rewards. It might be a barbecue at the end of the season or at the end of the event. But let's thank them for the work that they're doing. Ask them questions if they're concerned, and help point them to the right direction when it comes to safety in particular. All right, here's a question. What about court-ordered volunteers? They're not necessarily volunteering, but they may fall into that category if we bring them into our organization to do work for us. The court said, you've got to do some service, and so go to the city, go to the county, go to the district, and do this. What's the trusted advice when it comes to court-ordered service? Well, our advice is don't do it. People say, what? We get a lot of good. We got to get a lot of good work out of these inmates or court-ordered service. Here's our basic stance on this. We can get into trouble with a volunteer who is ordered by the court to do some service. They may not have your best interest in mind. They may have a chip on their shoulder, and so it puts us at risk. Here's an example of what we would recommend that you do. If a court says we've got a half a dozen people that we've ordered to do community service, and you guys need to take them and use them. Well, our recommendation is that you go back to the court and say, well, we don't want the liability that comes along with this. Would you sign an indemnification agreement showing that these volunteers, these court-ordered volunteers, are your employees and fall under your insurance, both general liability and workers' compensation? Generally, the court's response is, we're not going to do that. We don't want that risk, and that provides us an opportunity to say, well, we don't either. So if you can find some middle ground there where you're able to provide coverage, then you can go down that road. But be very careful with that. If you do that, if you insist on doing that, ensure that you have proper supervision, proper personal protective equipment, and that we don't provide an opportunity for somebody to get injured that really may not have our best interest in mind to start with. Imagine there'll be some questions on that one. We already hit this a little bit. What about service projects? My 3 sons, all just 2 weeks ago, or just over a week ago, my 3 sons all got their Eagle Scout. It's a good opportunity for us to get a project that will benefit our community. I look around my community, some of the best things that we have started out as an Eagle Scout project. And so there are great things there, but we have to be careful as well. Get involved, and I've seen many of your cities in particular look at the Eagle projects and verify that they're doing a good job and not just doing a halfway project, but verify that before they work. I've seen a few Eagle projects get really ugly and make some hazards in our cities. But we also need to protect our interest. Make sure that we verify coverage. If it's Boy Scout, and I just use them as an example, but it could be any one of the number of organizations. Verify that they have coverage. Get a certificate of insurance, naming you as additional insured. And my experience has been any reputable organization will be able to provide that to you. Okay, to summarize, volunteers provide us a great opportunity to get labor that we couldn't get otherwise, to get people that have great skills and talent for us, but they also provide risk to our organization. And so we just need to go into bringing volunteers in with our eyes open. Make sure that we're selecting the right people for the jobs that we have for them. That we're giving them some orientation, some training. We're supervising them and helping them to be successful and to not get injured or to cause problems to our organization. It sounds daunting, but it's a pretty simple process if we'll just take it a piece at a time and put programs into place to make sure that we've got that. All right, questions. It looks like we have quite a few here. Here's a comment. Also, backgrounds only show adult records, not juvenile records. Yeah, great point. And I will refer you back to that presentation on background checks for those. All right. You know what? I didn't. So let's go back to Jeff's question here about tennis. He also put in there that Lions Club also provides dinner. If we've got an organization coming in to provide dinner or something like that, it'd be a similar thing. Lions Club, we really appreciate you here, but we also have to protect our interests, and maybe you end up getting everybody sick because of the dinner that you provide here. We don't want to end up sued for that. So Lions Club, could you provide us a certificate of insurance? And generally they're going to easily provide that. They probably had to do it for other things. What about high school students that are doing community services, volunteers? Are they covered by school or by us? And once again, I refer you back to let's get the school to take the responsibility for these people coming in and doing that community service. If a loosely organized nonprofit organized volunteers to work at our facilities and they do not have a certificate of insurance, can we do an indemnification agreement? What limits or risks do we run for work comp medical? Yeah, that's a good question The problem is we can have an indemnification agreement there, but unless it's backed by a certificate of insurance showing that they have coverage, we're standing there. They're standing there saying, "Sorry, we don't have anything." But the city or the district or the county, they've got deep pockets, and we're part of their organization, so they need to pay. All right, we have another comment. Actually, the Department of Human Services say they do now look into juvenile records. Laws changed in the last couple of years. Okay, I wasn't aware of that. Let's see. So an agency director or designee should approve all volunteers. Human resource director, okay, intern coordinator. It really comes down to that chief executive. If a director, mayor, commissioner, whatever the city manager, administrator, whatever the big boss is, if they designate someone, it could be the HR director, but that person needs to be responsible to ensure that they keep that list up to date and that those people are appropriate for the task. Let's not take everybody in the community and put them on that list. We want to minimize the exposure that we have out there and make sure that they are they're actually volunteers and they're doing the work that we need them to do. If they stop participating, take them off the list. Okay, I said a lot of words. Hopefully they made a little bit of sense. I don't see any more questions there. Doug, Brent, anything I missed or anything you need to add?
Nothing else. Great job.
You, Doug?
Yeah, that was really good, Jason.
Well, I winged it, so hopefully.
Yeah, you winged it.
This is something that we have questions on regularly. This is something that probably at least weekly we have somebody call. Okay, what about this? What about that? And on the other side of that, we have had some bad situations where we ended up with volunteers getting into stuff they weren't supposed to, or we ended up with volunteers that we didn't know about. That came with a claim, and it made us ask questions. How much knowledge do we have? How much control do we have over what these interns do? And so we wanted to bring this subject up so people take a serious look at the risk that volunteers bring to us, because there are great benefits, but also some serious risks that go along with it. Thank you very much. Appreciate everybody's attendance. I thought this one was going to go quicker than that, but I ended up a little longer than I'd planned. Doug's about to say, yeah, like normal.
Hey, if it's under an hour.
It's under an hour. We hit it. Thanks, folks. Appreciate that. If you've got questions, please feel free to refer those to Doug Folsom. Now, you can give any one of us a call, and we'll be happy to help out on those. Okay. Thanks so much. Everybody have a great, safe day.